I caught my son-in-law kissing my wife in the kitchen. Not a peck. Not a mistake. The kind of kiss that tells you everything you didn't want to know. I stood in the doorway for maybe 3 seconds. Neither of them saw me. I backed out slowly, walked to my truck, sat down in the driver's seat, and stared at the steering wheel for a long time. The engine wasn't running. The radio wasn't on. It was just me and the quiet and the sound of everything I thought I knew falling apart. That was a Tuesday in October. My granddaughter's birthday was that Saturday. I had already bought her a wooden rocking horse from a craftsman in Vermont. It was sitting in my garage wrapped in a moving blanket. I went home that afternoon and unwrapped it. I sat on the garage floor next to that rocking horse for about an hour. Then I went inside, made myself a turkey sandwich, and started thinking. My name is not important. Call me what my daughter calls me, Dad. I'm 64 years old. I worked 31 years as a structural engineer for the county. I retired 3 years ago with a decent pension, a paid-off house, and a small piece of land outside of town that I bought in 1998 for reasons I couldn't fully explain even then. Something about wanting ground that was mine. My wife, I'll call her Beverly, and I had been married 37 years. We met in 1987 at a church potluck in Central Ohio. She brought a green bean casserole. I brought nothing because I forgot it was a bring-a-dish event. She gave me half of hers anyway. I thought that was the kindest thing a stranger had ever done for me. We built a life the slow, unremarkable way most people do. A house. 2 kids, my son Nelson, who lives in Seattle, and my daughter Irene. The kind of marriage that has quiet stretches and hard patches, and inside jokes about things nobody else would find funny. I thought we were solid. I thought we had the kind of marriage that doesn't need to be discussed because it simply is. Irene married a man named Colt about 4 years ago. I want to be careful here because Irene is my daughter and I love her, so I'll just say I never entirely warmed to Colt. Not because of anything I could point to specifically. He was polite enough. He showed up to things. He remembered birthdays, but there was something about the way he moved through a room that felt like he was always measuring it. Calculating square footage. Appraising value. He worked in finance. He drove a car that was more expensive than practical. He talked about investment returns the way some men talk about fishing, with an enthusiasm I could never fully share. Beverly loved him. She thought he was charming. She lit up when he was around in a way I hadn't seen her light up in a while. I noticed that. I told myself it was just nice for her to have a young person around who paid attention to her. I told myself a lot of things. Irene and Colt had a daughter, my granddaughter June, who's the best person I know. She's 4 years old, and she smells like sunscreen and she laughs with her whole body. Everything I did after that Tuesday in October, I did for June. I want to be clear about that. The first thing I did was nothing. I went back to my normal routine. I woke up in the mornings, made coffee, read the news on my tablet, took my walk. Beverly and I had dinner together. I watched whatever she wanted to watch on television. I slept in the same bed. I did not bring it up. I needed time to understand what I had seen and what it meant and what, if anything, I was going to do about it. About a week after the kitchen, I started paying attention differently, not suspiciously. I didn't install cameras or go through phones. I just watched. I listened. I noticed things I had trained myself not to notice. The way Beverly would glance at her phone and then set it face down. The way certain text notifications made her smile before she composed herself. The way she had started dressing slightly better on days when Irene's family was coming over. Small things. The kind of things that mean nothing on their own and everything together. I also started paying closer attention to my financial situation. I'm not a paranoid man. I don't believe the world is out to get me. But I am a structural engineer, and I've spent 31 years understanding that the things most likely to fail are the things nobody is watching. I started watching. Beverly and I had joint accounts, as married couples do. I had my pension, I had the house, I had the land, and I had a separate account, a modest one, that I had maintained quietly since the early 2000s, not hiding anything, just keeping something that was mine, a habit left over from watching my father lose everything in a bad business deal when I was 12 years old. What I found when I started actually looking at our joint finances was not catastrophic. Not yet. But there were patterns. Transfers I didn't remember authorizing. Cash withdrawals on days I couldn't account for. Small enough to miss if you weren't looking. Large enough to matter over time. I opened a spreadsheet and started tracking. I should tell you about my son Nelson. Nelson is 40 years old and lives in Seattle and works in software. We talk on the phone every Sunday. He is steady and careful, and he thinks before he speaks, which I always admired because I am the same way, and Beverly used to say it drove her crazy that she was outnumbered by quiet people. I called Nelson on a Wednesday evening in November. I told him what I had seen. I told him about the finances. I told him I didn't know yet what I was going to do, but I needed somebody to know. Nelson was quiet for a long time after I finished. That's how I knew he understood the weight of it. He said, "Dad, what do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to help me understand what I'm looking at, and I need you to not say anything to Irene yet." He agreed to both. Over the next 2 weeks, Nelson, who understands financial systems better than I do, helped me trace the patterns I'd found. It wasn't grand theft. It was gradual. The kind of erosion that happens when someone believes they have time on their side. Small transfers here. A joint account opened without my knowledge there. 2 of them, actually under Beverly's name alone, funded by money that had been slowly skimmed from our household accounts over what appeared to be the better part of a year. When we put it all together, the number was just over $40,000. I sat with that number for a few days. $40,000 is not everything, but it is not nothing. And what it told me was that this had not been a moment of weakness. This had been a plan. The thing about a plan is that it implies a future. I started asking myself, what is the future they are planning for? What does the end of this look like from where they're standing? Colt worked in finance. He knew how to move money. He knew the structures that protect assets and the ones that don't. I thought about the land. I thought about the house. I thought about my pension, which is not transferable, but which, in the event of my death, carries a spousal benefit. I thought about the fact that I was 64 years old, generally healthy, but not young, that I had recently had a routine cardiology appointment. Nothing serious, some monitoring, but that Beverly had been present for that conversation. That she knew more about the timeline of my health than most people did. I don't want to say out loud the full shape of what I was afraid of. I'll just say that I am a careful man, and careful men prepare for what they hope won't happen. I called a lawyer. Not a divorce attorney. Not yet. An estate attorney I had used years earlier when I set up my will. I told him I wanted to revisit some things. We met in his office on a Thursday afternoon and I explained the situation without dramatics. He listened. He asked a few questions. He did not seem shocked, which I found both comforting and unsettling. We spent the better part of 3 hours restructuring things. The land, which was only in my name to begin with, was transferred into a trust. The trust's sole beneficiary was June, my granddaughter. Not Irene and Colt. Not Beverly. June. The house was more complicated because Beverly was on the deed. But there are legal instruments for complication. My attorney knew them. We used them. I also changed my life insurance beneficiary from Beverly to Nelson, with instructions for a portion to be set aside for June's education. I updated my will entirely. When I left that office, the structure of what I had built over 31 years of work was no longer accessible to anyone I did not fully trust. It felt like putting on a seatbelt before a drive you're not sure you'll come back from. I need to tell you about the conversation with Irene. I had been protecting her from this. She was my daughter and Colt was her husband, and they had a child together, and I did not want to be the one to detonate her life. I had been carrying this alone. with Nelson's help, but alone in the way that matters, which is the daily weight of knowing something and acting normal. About 6 weeks after the kitchen, I asked Irene to meet me for lunch. Just the two of us. She was surprised. We didn't often do that. Just the two of us, without Beverly or Colt or June around. But she came. We went to a diner near her house that she had taken me to once before, and we ordered coffee and eggs, and I waited until after the food came. Then I told her what I saw in the kitchen. I told her about the financial accounts. I told her about the transfers. I told her the number. Irene did not cry. She did not yell. She picked up her coffee cup and put it back down without drinking from it. She stared at the table. After a long time, she said, "How long have you known?" I said, 6 weeks. She said, "He told me it was nothing, that it was a moment, it wouldn't happen again." The breath went out of me slowly. She had known. Not everything, not the money, but the kiss, the kitchen. She had known, and she had not told me, and she had been living with it for longer than I had. We sat there for a while without talking. The waitress refilled our coffee. Finally, Irene said, "What did you do?" I told her about the attorney. I told her about the trust. I told her that June's future was protected regardless of what happened next. She looked at me across the table, and she looked so much like herself at age 8. That same expression she had when she fell off her bike and was trying not to cry. And she said, "I should have told you sooner." "Dad," I said, "you were trying to protect me." She said, "So were you." We paid the check and walked to the parking lot, and I hugged my daughter for a long time in the November cold. Then we got in our separate cars and we drove home. What happened next unfolded over about 3 weeks. Irene and I had agreed on an approach. She would not tip off Colt that I knew about the money. She would begin meeting with her own attorney, a family law specialist she found independently, to understand her options. I would continue acting normal with Beverly. Normal is a strange thing to perform when you know what you know. I've thought about this a lot since. What is the ethics of a performance? Is it deception if the other person was deceiving you first? I don't have a clean answer. I just know that I got up every morning and made coffee and said good morning and did not let my face say what my mind knew. Beverly, for her part, did not notice, which told me something. In the second week of December, Nelson flew in from Seattle. We told Beverly it was just a visit, which was true in the way that most true things are also incomplete. Nelson and I met with my attorney again and finalized everything. We verified the transfers, documented the accounts, cross-referenced the timeline. The full picture when we laid it out. $43,000 moved over 14 months. 2 accounts. One in Beverly's name alone. One in a joint account with Colt that I had not been named on. This was not impulsive. This had been running in the background of our marriage like a program I didn't know was installed. What they had been building toward, as best as we could determine, was a scenario in which Beverly would initiate divorce, claim marital assets, including the house and land, and Colt would help facilitate the financial extraction while keeping the money already moved out of reach. Irene, I believe, was not part of that plan. She was just, in their calculation, someone who would follow along. They had not calculated for Irene, and they had not calculated for me. On a Sunday afternoon in December, 3 days before Christmas, Beverly brought up the subject of the land. We're having dinner. She made pot roast, which she knew I liked. She had been cooking things I liked for a few weeks, which I had also noticed. She poured wine, which we didn't usually have on Sundays. She said, "I've been thinking, that land out on Route 9. We've been sitting on it for 25 years and we've never done anything with it. Have you thought about selling?" I said. "What would we do with the money?" She said, "Invest it. Or use it. We're not getting younger, you know." I said, "I'll think about it." She said, "Colt knows someone who works in real estate development. He could probably get us a good price without even listing it." I looked at my pot roast. I said, "I'll think about it." After dinner, I washed the dishes and Beverly went to watch television. I stood at the kitchen sink and I thought about a green bean casserole at a church potluck in 1987 and the woman who gave a stranger half of hers because it was the kind thing to do. I thought about 37 years and a paid-off house and a granddaughter who laughs with her whole body. I dried my hands on the dish towel. I went and sat in the living room with Beverly. We watched television for 2 hours without talking. It was the last ordinary night I remember. Irene's attorney had advised her on timing. The week after Christmas, she informed Colt that she had retained counsel and would be filing for divorce. She did this in a letter delivered by the attorney's office. She did not do it in person. Colt called me that afternoon. He was not as collected as I expected. He wanted to know if I knew. He wanted to know what Irene had told me. His voice had a quality in it I had never heard before. Something between anger and fear, and I've learned in 64 years that combination makes people unpredictable. I said, I know what I need to know. He said, the land, I said, is not a topic for this conversation. He hung up. Beverly called me 20 minutes later. She was calmer than Colt, which I should not have been surprised by. She said she thought we needed to talk. I agreed. I told her I would meet her at the house the following afternoon. I had been staying at a hotel for 2 days at that point. I had quietly moved out the week before in stages without announcement. We sat at our kitchen table, the same kitchen where I had stood in the doorway 4 months earlier. The light came in through the window the way it always did in the afternoon, making the whole room look gentler than it was. Beverly looked at me for a long time. She said, "How long have you known?" I said, "October." She closed her eyes. She didn't ask how I found out. She didn't explain herself. She just said, "I'm sorry, Douglas." That's my name. I hadn't used it yet in the story because it wasn't relevant until now. But she said it. Douglas. The way she used to say it when we were younger, and she meant something by it. Like it was a word with weight. I said, "I know you are." We sat there for a while. Outside, a car went by. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking. The refrigerator hummed. I said, "The land is in a trust. It's been there since November. June is the beneficiary. That's not changing." She said, "I figured." I said, "The accounts you opened. I've documented all of it. My attorney has copies. If this becomes adversarial, that documentation becomes relevant." She said, "It won't become adversarial." I said, "Good." I stood up. I put on my coat. I looked around the kitchen one more time. The cabinet I had rehung in 2003. The tile I had laid myself. The window frame I had replaced after a storm took out a tree branch in 2011. I said, "I'll have my attorney be in touch about the house." I walked to the door. I stopped with my hand on the frame. I said, "You could have just asked me, Beverly. Whatever you needed, you could have just asked." She didn't say anything. I don't know if there was anything to say. I went to my truck. I drove to the hotel. I called Nelson and told him it was done. He said, "Are you okay, Dad?" I thought about it for a moment. The honest answer was something between yes and no, the complicated kind of okay that doesn't fit in a word. I said, "I will be." The divorce was finalized in the spring. The documentation of the financial transfers meant that Beverly's claim against the marital assets was significantly reduced. The house was sold and split under terms that reflected what had actually been happening in our marriage rather than the version she had been planning for. Colt's and Irene's divorce was finalized 2 months later. He retained an attorney who made noise for a while about various things. The noise didn't change anything structural. Irene got primary custody of June. Colt got a visitation schedule he didn't like, and a financial settlement that did not include access to the land trust. June turned 5 in the spring. I brought her the rocking horse, the one that had been sitting in my garage since October, still wrapped in its moving blanket. She named him Biscuit immediately, with the certainty that only 4- and 5-year-olds have about names. I sat on the floor of Irene's new apartment and watched my granddaughter ride her horse, and I felt something I don't have a word for. Not happiness exactly. Not relief. Something quieter than both of those. Something that felt like arriving somewhere after a very long drive. Irene brought me a cup of coffee and sat down next to me on the floor. We watched June together. She said, "Thank you for not telling me what to do." I said, "You didn't need to be told." She leaned her head on my shoulder for a moment. Just a moment. Then she sat back up and sipped her coffee. June looked over at us from her horse and said, "Daddy, watch," and then realized I wasn't Daddy and corrected herself without embarrassment. "Grandpa, watch," and kicked her heels against the horse's wooden sides. I watched. I'm still watching. That's what we do. Those of us who are left standing after something like this. We watch the things that matter. We stay present. We don't look away. I am 64 years old, and I have lost a marriage I thought would last the rest of my life. I have watched my daughter go through something no daughter should have to go through. I have learned that love and deception can live in the same house for a very long time, without you knowing. But I also know that I did not panic. I did not react from anger. I built something solid before the storm arrived, and when it did arrive, the things I had protected held. My granddaughter is riding a wooden horse named Biscuit in a small apartment in Ohio. The land on Route 9 is in a trust with her name on it. Someday it will be hers. 23 acres of Ohio hardwood, and a creek that runs clear in the spring, and a small clearing where I used to sit and not think about anything in particular. I bought it in 1998 for reasons I couldn't fully explain. Now I can explain them. It was always for her. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Not the legal parts. Those resolve themselves the way these things do, slowly and then all at once. I mean the quieter part. The part where you're standing at a kitchen sink drying your hands on a dish towel, and you realize the life you thought you were living was not entirely the life that was actually happening. I don't think Beverly was a bad person from the beginning. I think people make small choices that seem manageable at the time, and then those small choices accumulate into something they can no longer explain or undo. That's not an excuse. It's just the honest way I've come to understand it. Every transfer she made, every account she opened, every morning she sat across from me at breakfast knowing what she was building in the background. Each one of those was a choice. And choices, over time, become a person. They became who she was in those years. That's the part that's hard to look at directly. What I keep returning to is this. I almost missed it. Not because I was foolish, but because I was trusting. There's a difference, and I think it matters. Trust is not naivety. I trusted Beverly because 37 years had given me reasons to. When those reasons quietly stopped being true, I didn't know immediately, and I don't think that failure was mine. What was mine was what I did once I knew. I've thought about what would have happened if I had walked into that kitchen and reacted from anger, if I had confronted Beverly that Tuesday afternoon and said everything I felt. I would have lost the element of the only thing that actually protected me. Time. Anger is loud and satisfying for about 48 hours. Then it becomes expensive. What I did instead was stay quiet and stay deliberate, and that discipline cost me something emotionally that I won't pretend it didn't. But it saved the land. It saved the structure I had spent a working life building. And it saved the structure I had spent a working life building. And it saved June's future. Irene didn't need me to tell her what to do. She needed me to not panic so that she had room to think clearly herself. I think that's something fathers don't always understand. Sometimes the most useful thing you can be for your child is steady. Not loud. Not certain. Just steady. Nelson flew across the country and sat in my attorney's office and helped me trace 14 months of financial transactions without once telling me how to feel about it. That's what love looks like when it's fully grown. It's not comfort, and it's not advice. It's presence. Showing up and doing the work and trusting that the person you love will find their own footing. I am not a perfect man. I worked long hours for years that I cannot get back. I was quieter in my marriage than I should have been. And I should have been, and I mistook the absence of conflict for the presence of health. These are things I carry. But I know this. When the moment came that required me to be clear-headed and careful and patient, I was. That wasn't luck. That was 31 years of learning how to look at a structure and understand what it can bear and what it cannot. I just never expected to apply it to my own life. June is 5 years old, and she has 23 acres of Ohio hardwood with her name on it. She doesn't know that yet. Someday I'll take her there and walk the creek line with her. And maybe I'll tell her the whole story. Or maybe I'll just let her run through the clearing and I'll watch her. And that will be enough. The land was always hers. I just had to make sure it got to her.